Inside the U.S. Capitol, Jasmine Crockett goes head-to-head with Jim Jordan over one explosive question. Did he knowingly block justice for over 177 abused student-athletes at Ohio State? Jordan tries to downplay the past in claiming ignorance. But just minutes later, Crockett flips the entire hearing with undeniable evidence that shatters his defense. Jordan's reputation unravels, his career hangs by a thread, and the nation demands answers. But what did Jasmine say that froze the room, silenced Congress, and sent Jim Jordan into hiding? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Inside the Rayburn House office building, room 2261 was packed to capacity, the kind of moment that doesn't just make headlines, but rewrites reputations. Cameras were rolling, C-SPAN was live, and at the center of it all sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, expression unreadable, posture sharp. She wasn't here to posture. She was here for answers. The hearing was officially about ethics and responsibility in collegiate athletics. But Crockett had another target in mind, one sitting just a few feet away. Congressman Jim Jordan, former assistant wrestling coach at Ohio State University, sat stiff, trying to look indifferent. He had faced questions before. He had denied everything before. But this time, it was different. This time, Crockett wasn't going to let him walk away untouched. She rose from her seat slowly, with the precision of someone who had been waiting for this opportunity, not for days but for years. Her voice was calm, but there was no mistaking the edge. Mr. Chairman, I am formally requesting time to redirect this inquiry toward Representative Jim Jordan. A few heads turned. Jordan's eyes narrowed. Given his direct involvement with Ohio State University during the period of documented sexual abuse by Dr. Richard Strauss, I believe it is necessary we hear from him today. The room shifted. There was movement among the staffers. A few exchanged glances. Everyone had heard of the Strauss case. More than 170 men abused over 2 decades. Many had long suspected that people knew. People who chose not to speak. People in power, like Jim Jordan. Jordan leaned forward, adjusted his mic, and gave a familiar response. Congresswoman Crockett, with all due respect, I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I never saw or heard anything inappropriate, ever. Crockett didn't break eye contact. That's a strong statement, but I want the American people to know what that silence really means. She opened a heavy folder, placing it gently in front of her. On the front cover, in bold red letters, it read, Victims of Dr. Strauss. Confirmed reports, 1978 to 1998. She looked directly at Jordan. You were a coach. You had an office down the hall. You showered in the same locker rooms. And you're telling this committee you never once noticed a pattern? Never once heard a student complain? Not one? Jordan shifted in his seat. His face tightened. I've already addressed this publicly. Crockett's voice lowered, but her words became even clearer. Let me address it publicly for you. These aren't accusations from anonymous blogs. These are testimonies from grown men, some of whom were just teenagers when it happened, saying they came to you for help, and you brushed them off. Or worse, laughed it off. She paused, letting the weight of the silence sink into the room. Then she continued, slower now. This isn't about politics. This isn't about left or right. This is about boys, young men, who walked into college trusting the system would protect them. Trusting you, Coach Jordan, to protect them. Her hands moved to the stack of papers in front of her. There are 177 names here. Real people. Real stories. Some of them are still in therapy. Some of them have taken their own lives. What they share in common is this. They were hurt, they tried to speak up, and no one listened. Especially not you. Jordan raised a hand slightly as if to object, but Crockett cut him off, firm, respectful, but unyielding. I'm not here to scream. I'm not here to shame. I'm here to ask one question, and I want a real answer. When did your silence become easier than their pain? The room was still. No one spoke. No one moved. And for the first time that day, Jim Jordan had nothing to say. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The truth was coming, through the voices of men who had waited half a lifetime to be believed. And in this room, Packed with cameras and denial, she was about to give them the floor. She stepped to the side, reached for the laptop in front of her, and with a single deliberate keystroke, the courtroom monitors lit up. A grainy video began to play, dated, unpolished, but unmistakably real. On screen sat Mike DiSabato, the former Ohio State wrestler who first blew the whistle in 2018. His face was drawn, his voice hoarse, but his words cut with clarity. "We all knew about Strauss," he said plainly, staring down the camera. "And so did Coach Jordan. He was there when we joked about it. We thought it was just some twisted part of the program, but we knew. We were kids trying to make sense of something that never should have happened." He paused, eyes flicking away, then back. "I told him, Jim Jordan, directly. He knew." A hush fell over the room, not respectful, not procedural, but heavy, like the oxygen had been sucked out of the air. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't glance at Jordan. Instead, she let the screen fade to black for a full 5 seconds before cueing the next clip. This time it was Dunyasha Yetz, younger in the video, but no less wounded. He leaned forward at the table, arms folded tight, as if bracing himself. "When I reported Strauss," he said slowly, "I didn't go to just anybody. I went to Coach Jordan. I told him what was happening. His response?" He paused, jaw tight. "Toughen up." That's what he told me. That it was part of the culture. That I should stop whining and focus on wrestling. He looked directly into the lens. That moment stuck with me. Not just because I was ignored, but because it told me how much silence was expected. When the video cut off, the room remained still. No coughs, no chair shuffling, not even the click of a reporter's keyboard. It was the kind of silence that only came when something inside a room broke, when denial met something it couldn't outrun. Jasmine finally turned her head, her voice quiet but resolute. "These aren't political attacks. These are testimonies, made under oath, on camera, by men who remember the exact words they heard when they asked for help." She looked directly at Jordan. "And those words came from you." The screen faded to black, but the silence it left behind was deafening. No one in the room moved, not because they didn't want to, but because they couldn't. It was the kind of silence that pressed against your chest and made breathing feel like betrayal. And in that silence, Jim Jordan finally snapped. He leaned forward sharply, his hand gripping the microphone, as if steadying himself. His voice, tense and edged with frustration, broke the stillness. "I don't remember any of that," he said. "I don't remember those conversations. I don't remember anyone coming to me with those kinds of allegations." He was louder now, less polished. The carefully managed tone he'd maintained all morning had given way to something raw. His face was tight, jaw clenched, eyes darting, not out of strength, but as if searching for an exit that wasn't there. "These people, these former athletes, they say things happened 25, 30 years ago. I coached a lot of guys. I can't be expected to remember every single thing that was said back then." His words came faster, as if outrunning something inside him. "I never ignored abuse. I never covered for anyone." For a few seconds, no one responded. Jasmine Crockett didn't speak right away. She didn't shift in her seat. She let the words hang, heavy and desperate, until the only thing left in the room was the sound of Jim Jordan trying to convince himself. Then calmly, she leaned into the microphone. Her tone was steady, controlled not because she lacked emotion, but because she had learned how to hold fire without letting it burn her. "They don't need you to remember, Congressman," she said quietly, but clearly enough that every syllable struck like a drumbeat. "They're not asking for your memory. They're asking for your accountability." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of every victim who had ever been told their pain didn't matter unless someone powerful could confirm it. She continued, her voice growing firmer. "This isn't about the gaps in your memory. It's about the gap between what you knew and what you chose to do." She paused, eyes locked on him. "You say you don't remember, but they do. They remember every look, every moment of humiliation, every time they reached out, hoping someone would stop it. And you were right there." Her final words weren't shouted. They didn't need to be. "You can forget. They don't have that luxury." Behind her, the stack of names sat untouched, but no one in that room could ignore them now. She had let his denials echo long enough. Now it was time for something harder to erase. Something that didn't forget, didn't falter, and didn't come from memory. Paper. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Instead, she calmly slid a document across the polished surface of the table, letting it land directly in front of the microphone. The plastic sleeve reflected the fluorescent light above, like glass over a headstone. "This," she said, her voice steady but cold, "is a memorandum dated April 4th, 1994. It originated from the Ohio State Athletic Department, and it didn't whisper, it warned." She paused, scanning the room. In this memo, a staff athletic trainer expressed concern. No, more than concern, alarm, about repeated instances of inappropriate physical contact between Dr. Richard Strauss and multiple members of the wrestling team. Her eyes found Jordan. "It didn't go to the press. It didn't go to lawyers. It went to your department, internally, directly." She took a breath, but it wasn't to pause. It was to sharpen. It was sent to the head wrestling coach. It was also sent to 2 assistant coaches. And finally, it was carbon copied, CC'd, to one other staff member, James D. Jordan. A murmur swept across the room. Jordan sat up, rigid, but said nothing. His face was pale, lips pressed into a line. Jasmine continued. "Your name is here, not just whispered in testimony, not buried in memory, but printed, preserved, tied to a warning that was given 4 years before the first public lawsuit." She lifted the memo slightly, angling it toward the press box. "This isn't hearsay. This isn't hindsight. This is contemporary documentation of a predator, and proof that those around him were told." He looked for the nearest exit, not with his feet, but with his words. And when the evidence refused to vanish, Jim Jordan did what too many powerful men do when the truth corners them. He attacked its legitimacy. Jordan adjusted the microphone again, but this time there was hesitation in his fingers, as if even the machinery might reject what he was about to say. "Let's be clear," he began, voice firmer than before, but missing its earlier conviction. "This document, whatever it is, doesn't carry any formal weight. There's no institutional stamp, no university letterhead. We don't even know where it came from. Anyone could have typed it. It's not an official record." He motioned vaguely toward the plastic-sealed memo, as though touching it might somehow make it more real. "You're treating it like it's some sort of bombshell, but you can't even prove it went through the right administrative channels?" He exhaled sharply, trying to steady his delivery. "I'm not saying people didn't have concerns. I'm saying this. This memo is not verified. It's reckless to treat it like hard evidence." For a moment, there was no immediate response. Crockett didn't rush. She didn't interrupt. She simply allowed the air to tighten around his words until they started folding in on themselves. Then she spoke, soft, controlled, and with a clarity that left no room for interpretation. "You're right. It's not stamped in gold. It doesn't have a watermark. It's not framed on a wall somewhere in the university president's office." She looked down at the memo, then back up, locking eyes with him. "But neither were the boys who came to you. They didn't show up with paperwork. They came with bruises, with questions, with fear, and they were met with silence." Her voice didn't rise. It deepened, anchored by something heavier than anger. "You want to hide behind technicalities? Fine. But technicalities don't erase accountability. That memo might not have a seal, Mr. Jordan, but it had your name, your initials. It didn't need to be certified to be read, and you were one of the people it was sent to." She paused, letting that sink in. "So let me ask you plainly. When a young man stands in front of you and says, 'Something's wrong,' do you ask for documentation, or do you listen?" Her tone grew colder, not cruel but cutting. "You didn't need a notarized complaint to know those kids were in pain. You needed eyes, ears, and the courage to do something. But you chose comfort. You chose silence." No one spoke. The memo lay between them like a line in the sand, and on the wrong side of it stood a man who had run out of places to hide. If testimony could be dismissed and documentation ignored, then Jasmine would show him something even harder to deny, something no one could claim was hypothetical. She would show him the human cost, one name at a time. Without breaking eye contact with the man across from her, Jasmine reached down beside her chair and lifted a rectangular box onto the desk. It was simple, unmarked, and quiet in the way coffins are quiet. She opened the lid, pulled out the first sheet, and placed it gently on the table. A single name, printed in bold black ink, filled the page. Then another, and another. No theatrics, no raised voice, just the steady rhythm of truth being placed in plain sight. Each name belonged to a former student-athlete who had come forward in the Ohio State investigation. Each one a man who had been ignored, overlooked, or dismissed by the very system that was supposed to protect him. Jasmine did not speak immediately. She let the sound of paper on wood, soft but final, do what words couldn't. Then finally she spoke. These are not just names in a report. These are not anonymous entries buried in legal filings. These are human beings who sat across from an investigator, looked them in the eye and said, "This happened to me." She didn't look down at the pages. She looked at Jordan. They walked into a university thinking it was a place of learning, of honor, of safety, and they left carrying shame that wasn't theirs to bear. She held up a page for the room to see. This one was a freshman. He reported Strauss to his trainer, and according to his account, that complaint went nowhere. She placed the page back down, softer this time, almost like she was tucking it in. He said he cried in the shower after practice for a month. Alone. Jordan sat motionless, but the tension in his shoulders betrayed him. Jasmine continued, her voice quieter now, but no less firm. There are 177 names in this box. Every one of them had to choose between speaking up and being believed. And most chose silence, because when one of them finally did speak, the men in charge shrugged, or laughed, or walked away. Her eyes narrowed. You were one of those men, and whether you remember their names or not, they remember yours. She spread the remaining pages across the table like evidence in a trial no one had the courage to hold. Until now. The names weren't accusations. They were proof. And for the first time in that hearing room, the weight of those pages felt heavier than politics. The names were still spread across the table like silent indictments, but now all eyes returned to Jordan. No more paper, no more video, just the man. And when the weight became too much, he spoke, not with defiance, but with something far closer to defeat. He leaned back in his chair as if something inside him had given way. His shoulders, so square when the hearing began, slumped under the invisible pressure. He didn't meet Jasmine's gaze this time. Instead, he looked past her, to no one in particular, as if the answer might be waiting somewhere on the far wall. I didn't have any real authority, he said quietly, almost to himself. I was an assistant coach. I wasn't in charge of discipline. I wasn't the guy making calls. His voice cracked slightly and he cleared his throat in a poor attempt to hide it. I didn't have the power to change anything. I wasn't even sure anyone would believe me. He paused, lips pressing into a thin line, then added, softer still, I didn't know what to do. The moment hung, fragile and unfinished, like a dropped confession that didn't quite land. Jasmine didn't move right away. She let the silence speak. Because sometimes the most damning truths are buried inside the very things people tell themselves to feel less guilty. Then she leaned forward, not out of aggression, but something colder, deeper, more exacting. Her voice didn't rise. It narrowed. You didn't need power, she said, each word deliberate. You needed principle. Her eyes didn't waver. Those boys didn't come to you looking for policy change. They came looking for someone to see them, to hear them, to do something. She gestured gently toward the stack of names still covering the table. You say you were just a coach, but to them, you were the grown man in the room, the one who wasn't supposed to look away. Her tone deepened, not in volume, but in truth. You didn't need clearance. You didn't need a committee. You didn't even need certainty. All you needed was the courage to say, this is wrong, and the decency to say it out loud. She sat back slowly. And you didn't. That final line didn't accuse, it pronounced. And in its stillness, it made one thing painfully clear. His silence had never been a lack of power. It had always been a choice. The room was already heavy with silence. But Jasmine wasn't finished. Because behind every name on that table was a voice, once ignored, once dismissed, and now for the first time in decades, it was about to be heard. She unfolded a single page, visibly aged and creased down the center, like someone had folded it and refolded it over and over, trying to forget. Jasmine held it carefully, not as evidence, but as something more fragile, truth finally given permission to exist. Her voice was clear, but it carried the weight of something deeply human. This is from testimony number 62, she began, glancing briefly at the committee before looking back to the page. A former student athlete, age 18. He was just a freshman. She paused, then read, I waited until practice ended. Everyone else was gone. I walked up to Coach Jordan, nervous as hell, and said, Coach, Dr. Strauss touched me. It didn't feel right. Jasmine's voice didn't shake, but her tone tightened, like someone trying not to look away. He looked at me, didn't even blink, and said, Don't talk like that. Don't make things up. She let the words sit in the air, unmoving. He told me to stop overreacting, that Strauss was a doctor, and I should be grateful we had medical support at all. She folded the page again, slowly, and placed it back in the folder. That boy never spoke up again. For the next 2 decades, he carried what happened as if it was his fault. Jordan shifted. This time his face was red, not with anger, but pressure. He leaned in suddenly, breaking the tension like glass shattering on tile. You're using their pain, he said, voice sharper now. Not broken, but weaponized. You're standing here reading stories from people who trusted a confidential investigation. Not to get justice, but to boost your political image. You want airtime. You want applause. Don't act like this is about them. It's about you. He sat back, breathing harder, eyes darting, half at her, half at the cameras. His words had landed, but they didn't stick. Jasmine didn't flinch. In fact, she barely moved at all. She let the accusation breathe, then answered with something far more cutting than outrage. Truth. You think I'm here for attention? She said, her voice low but unwavering. If I wanted applause, I'd be telling people what they wanted to hear. But I'm not. She placed a hand on the folded page. I'm telling this room what it chose to forget, what it buried, what it excused. And I'm saying it out loud because someone has to. She leaned forward now, not for effect, but to make sure he saw her clearly. I don't want headlines. I want that 18-year-old boy to know he wasn't crazy, that his silence wasn't cowardice, that someone finally believes him. Her voice cracked slightly, but she didn't pull back. I'm not trying to win. I'm trying to make sure no kid ever again walks into a locker room and leaves feeling smaller than when he arrived. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was sacred. No one reached for a phone. No one whispered. Because in that moment, what had begun as a hearing had become something else entirely. A reckoning. The weight in the room was already unbearable. But Jasmine wasn't done. There was one final voice. Raw, unfiltered, and personal. Not from a courtroom, not from a hearing, from an inbox. And this time, the silence that followed would have no place to hide. Jasmine reached into a smaller folder. This one different. It was thin, labeled in her own handwriting, unsent but received. Her fingers were slow and deliberate, her expression locked in something that looked like restraint, but underneath was heat, controlled, focused, earned. She tapped her mic gently and spoke, not to the committee, not to the cameras, but to the conscience of the room. This is not from the official investigation. This is not sworn testimony, she said. This is an email, written 2 years ago by a man who never filed a lawsuit, never spoke to a lawyer, never went on record. He simply wanted someone to read it. He wrote it, he never sent it, and a friend of his gave it to our team just last month. His only request? That someone finally say it out loud. She unfolded the paper and began to read. Her voice was lower now, measured like every word was glass. Dear Coach Jordan, it begins. You probably don't remember me. I was just another kid in the room, another pair of shoes on the mat. But I remember you. I remember the way you stood with your arms folded while Strauss walked around like he owned our bodies. I remember the day I came to you after weights. I said, something's not right. And you looked at me like I was the one who was broken, like I was the problem, not Strauss, not the doctor, me. Jasmine paused for just half a second, not to breathe, but to let the words land. She continued, steadier than before. I remember thinking, maybe I'm soft, maybe this is how it works, maybe I just need to shut up and earn my spot. But I was 18, and I was scared, and I trusted you. That's what hurts most, coach. You weren't a stranger. You were supposed to be the one who gave a damn. Jasmine folded the email back into itself and placed it gently in the center of the table, as if returning something sacred to where it belonged. He never sent that message. He didn't think it would matter. She turned to Jordan, her eyes steady, voice calm but deadly clear. But today, Congressman, it matters. For the first time in the hearing, Jordan didn't reach for the mic. His hand hovered above it, then dropped. His jaw tightened. His gaze fell, not in shame, but in calculation, in retreat. There was a long pause, the kind that wasn't procedural, wasn't strategic. It was human. When he finally spoke, his voice lacked its earlier resistance. I don't remember that, he said quietly. I don't remember that conversation. If it happened the way he says, I wish he had pushed harder. If he had said something more specific, more direct, I would have acted. I didn't know. And if I did, I would have done something. His voice trailed off. He didn't raise his eyes. He didn't raise his tone. He had returned to the same phrase he had clung to from the beginning. I don't remember. The moment didn't need a rebuttal. It begged for one. Jasmine leaned forward, her voice low, not harsh but sharp enough to draw blood. That's the tragedy, Congressman, she said, her words cutting like glass under pressure. Not that you remembered too little, but that he remembered everything and still blames himself. She tapped the email. He was 18, and he carried that silence like a sentence. Because someone in your position, someone with authority in his life, made him feel like the pain was his to own. She paused, letting the next line strike from its own momentum. You say you don't remember, but let's be clear. It wasn't your memory that failed him. It was your duty. Her voice was rising now, not in volume, but in precision, like a spotlight narrowing on a final confession. You want to believe forgetting absolves you, that the passage of time has smudged the lines between mistake and decision. But it hasn't, because Strauss didn't stop. He didn't slow down. He went on to harm more students. And the years between that boy's cry for help and Strauss's exposure were not empty. They were filled with names that could have been spared. The room was frozen. Not one cough, not one whisper. She locked eyes with him and delivered the final blow, not as a political opponent, but as someone speaking on behalf of the people history had told to wait. Your failure to act wasn't neutral. It was permission. And your so-called lack of memory? She leaned in, her final line barely above a whisper, but stronger than anything shouted that day. That choice not to remember gave a predator 4 more years of freedom. No one moved. No one dared. Because in that moment, everyone understood. It wasn't about one man forgetting. It was about an entire system deciding not to care. And Jasmine Crockett had just forced it to remember. And just when it seemed like the silence had nothing left to surrender, Jasmine reached for something even deeper, buried not in memory but in bureaucracy. Because long after the boy stopped speaking, Washington had its own chance to act. And Jim Jordan stopped that too. Jasmine opened a new folder, this one heavier, stamped with a seal no one in the room could question. House Judiciary Committee. Internal Memorandum, 2019. The paper was stiff, official, and cold in the way truth often becomes when it's hidden behind process. She held it up, letting the light catch the header, and then placed it gently on the table in front of her. Her tone shifted, not from passion to formality, but to something sharper, precision. This document, she said, tapping the first page, was written nearly 5 years ago by staff attorneys for the Judiciary Committee. It outlines a recommendation, quiet, internal, and never brought to public light, that this body re-examine allegations tied to Ohio State's abuse scandal, specifically the conduct of congressional staff and former coaches who now hold federal office. She let that hang in the air before continuing. The memo called for a review, not a conviction, not a punishment, just a deeper look into what members of this institution might have known and what they chose not to report. She turned to the second page and read aloud. Given the volume of public statements and contradictions in prior testimony, the committee recommends a preliminary fact-finding phase into Representative Jim Jordan's involvement during his tenure as assistant wrestling coach at Ohio State University. She didn't dramatize it. She didn't need to. The words spoke louder than outrage. Due to credible witness accounts, further scrutiny is justified to protect the credibility of Congress and the integrity of federal oversight. Then she stopped reading. She looked up, her eyes locked onto Jordan. That investigation never happened, she said quietly, because within 48 hours, this memo was pulled. The staff who wrote it were redirected. The oversight chair was leaned on, and the recommendation was blocked by you. The shift in the room was instant. The staffers behind the dais shifted in their seats. Reporters leaned forward in their chairs. The temperature hadn't changed, but suddenly everyone felt colder. Jordan, who had been slumped minutes earlier, now sat up. His hands gripped the table, his jaw visibly clenched. When he finally spoke, his voice was no longer cautious. It was loud, defensive, and bristling with the kind of fury that tries to rewrite history by sheer force of tone. I did what any responsible member of Congress would do, he said. I shut down a baseless, partisan attempt to smear me based on rumor. That memo had no substantiated evidence. It was speculation dressed up in legalese, and I stopped it to protect the integrity of this committee. I was defending the institution. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She waited as if giving him one last chance to hear the echo of his own words. Then she spoke, and when she did, the chill returned. You weren't defending the institution, she said. You were defending yourself. Her voice didn't rise, but it struck harder than anything he'd said all morning. You didn't block that inquiry because it was baseless. You blocked it because it was dangerously close to the truth. Because if the committee had pulled one thread, it would have led straight back to a locker room in Ohio and the silence you chose to keep. She leaned forward, both hands resting on the folder like the weight of it belonged to her. You didn't protect Congress. You protected the myth of your own innocence. You used your title not to serve, but to bury, to delay, to silence the very process you now claim to respect. Her words came faster now, but never out of control. You wore your power like armor when it should have been a window. You used your position not to ask harder questions, but to make sure they were never asked at all. Jordan tried to speak again, but she raised a hand, not to silence him, but to finish. You want to talk about the credibility of Congress? She said. How credible are we when a man can kill an investigation into his own past without a single vote, without a single hearing, without even the decency of disclosure? Her voice dropped to a whisper, but it landed like a verdict. You didn't just ignore the pain. You erased the pathway to justice. And then, with one final motion, she slid the memo across the table, closer to him than before. The same hands that had once laid down the names of 177 survivors now delivered proof that Congress itself had tried to look the other way. Only this time, the paper bore more than names. It bore complicity. The room didn't move. The cameras didn't blink. And the man who once said, "I don't remember," was now staring at the proof that he had made sure no one else would either. The evidence was on the table, the testimony spoken, the silence shattered. But Jasmine knew there was still one question left, one that couldn't be answered by documents or deflected by politics. It had to come from the man himself. And so she asked it. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Jasmine Crockett looked across the table, past the microphones, past the cameras, and into the eyes of the man who had spent the last 2 hours dodging, denying, and deflecting. Her tone was calm, eerily calm, but it carried more force than anything shouted could have. "Congressman Jordan," she said, her voice almost a whisper, "have you ever looked one of them in the eye and said the words, 'I'm sorry'?" The room went still, the kind of still that doesn't invite noise. It forbids it. A question like that didn't need elaboration. It didn't need legal framing or political cover. It was the question. And for the first time since the hearing began, Jim Jordan had no answer prepared. He blinked. His shoulders stiffened, his hands shifted, but he didn't speak. He opened his mouth slightly, then closed it again, as if trying to form a sentence that didn't exist. The silence stretched, long enough to be uncomfortable, long enough to expose something raw. He didn't look at her. He looked past her, toward the committee chair, toward the press pool, anywhere but at the woman who had just demanded something simple and human. The room watched him, not as a politician now, but as a man who had been asked for decency and couldn't seem to find it. When he finally spoke, the words were low, defensive, and laced with brittle defiance. "I'm not going to sit here and be insulted," he said, shifting in his seat. "Not by you, not by anyone. I'm done being scapegoated for something I didn't do." He sat back in his chair, folded his arms tightly, and added with sharper force, "I'm not going to apologize for something I wasn't involved in. I've said it before. I don't recall anyone ever coming to me. If they had, I would have done something. But I didn't see it. I didn't hear it. So no, I'm not going to stand here and let you pin that guilt on me." Crockett's expression didn't change. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She let his words fall flat in the middle of the table, where they echoed with all the weight of a door slamming shut in a child's face. And when she finally spoke again, her voice was softer than before, but colder too. It wasn't fury. It was truth, delivered with the clarity of someone who no longer had anything left to prove. "If you truly didn't do anything," she said, "then that's exactly the problem." Her words hit like a slow blade. Because while Strauss was abusing students for decades, while young men were walking into locker rooms and leaving scarred, you were there. Not in theory, not as a bystander on TV. You were in the building, you were in the program, and you left with clean hands and a quiet mouth. She leaned in slightly, not to intimidate, but to narrow the distance between truth and the man still trying to outrun it. "You think this hearing is about shame? It's not. It's about accountability. And what you've shown us today is that you can't even hold eye contact with the people you failed, let alone say two words that might help them heal." Jordan shifted again. For the first time, the exhaustion was visible, not just in his eyes, but in the slump of his shoulders, in the way his defenses no longer landed. He didn't interrupt her. Not this time. Because deep down, even he knew there was no rebuttal left. The documents had spoken, the testimonies had spoken, and now her voice was the last thing standing between him and the silence he had spent his career avoiding. "You call this a smear campaign," she continued, "but the only thing being smeared here is the truth, by your refusal to face it." Her hands gestured toward the names on the table, the pages stacked like gravestones of missed chances. "You say you weren't involved, but involvement doesn't always come in the form of action. Sometimes it comes from what you chose not to do, from who you chose not to believe, from what you saw but didn't say. And Congressman, you can call that forgetting. You can call that misremembering. But to the boys who walked into your office and left unheard, it felt like betrayal." She paused again, just long enough to let the last word echo, not in the room, but in the conscience of everyone listening. "Betrayal," she repeated, softer now. "And the fact that you still can't say you're sorry, not even when handed the exact words, not even now, that tells me everything I need to know." Her voice grew firmer, like the final note of a closing argument. "You don't need to apologize to me. You need to apologize to the boys who spent 20 years thinking they were crazy, who blamed themselves for not being louder, who wondered if silence meant it was all their fault." There was a beat of stillness so thick, even the air seemed to hold its breath. And then Jasmine delivered the final blow, not shouted, not dramatic, but spoken with the kind of still power that feels like judgment. "I asked you a simple question, one any decent man could answer in a heartbeat. But you couldn't, and that tells me you're still more afraid of blame than you are of truth." She sat back in her chair, hands folded, the stack of testimony still in front of her. No dramatic exit, no closing monologue, just one simple act. She looked him in the eye, the very thing he had failed to do. And this time, he looked away first. Jasmine's words didn't just remain in the hearing room. They exploded beyond it, ripping through the walls of Congress, across social media feeds, into living rooms, radio shows, college campuses, and finally into the country's bloodstream. The reckoning had gone viral. Within hours of the hearing's end, the clip of Jasmine Crockett confronting Jim Jordan flooded every corner of the internet. It wasn't polished, it wasn't edited, it was raw, direct, and impossible to ignore. The moment she looked him in the eye and asked, "Have you ever apologized to a single victim?" was looped endlessly on X, TikTok, YouTube, and network news broadcasts. That single frame, her calm defiance, his visible discomfort, became an instant symbol. By the 24th hour, it had crossed 10 million views. By hour 48, it surpassed 40 million. And still it grew, not just because of what was said, but because the country recognized something painfully familiar in what had been revealed. Power refusing accountability. 3 hashtags rose to the top of trending lists within hours. #, Jordan knew, #, Justice for OSU, and #, Crockett speaks for us. They weren't political slogans. They were declarations, shorthand for a truth that couldn't be unseen. Survivors of abuse, from Ohio to Oregon, began reposting the video, adding their own captions. "This is the first time I've ever felt seen." One former OSU athlete, previously anonymous, posted a single line that was retweeted 600,000 times. "He told me to shut up, and now the world knows." News anchors debated whether the moment marked a shift in congressional culture or just another media cycle. But outside of Washington, something different was happening, something deeper. Victim advocacy groups, some long ignored, began holding press conferences, not to defend Jasmine Crockett, but to stand with her. The Survivors Alliance of Collegiate Athletes held a candlelight vigil outside the Capitol, reading aloud the names of all 177 documented victims from the Ohio State scandal. Each name was met with a bell chime. When they reached the last name, the crowd began chanting, "Say their names, don't protect silence." Crockett's office was flooded with calls, some supportive, some enraged, but all intense. Survivors wrote her. Retired coaches wrote her. A mother from Dayton sent a voicemail in tears saying, "My son tried to tell his coach in 1997, 'Thank you for being the woman who finally said what he couldn't.'" Meanwhile, Jim Jordan's camp went into lockdown mode. All scheduled campaign stops were quietly canceled. The Ohio town halls were postponed. The fundraiser in Dallas, meant to feature him as keynote, was suddenly missing his name from all marketing. Publicly, his spokesperson said the congressman was taking time to focus on legislative duties. But inside political circles, it was clear. He was reeling. Fox News, normally a Jordan stronghold, aired back-to-back segments. One anchor defended him, calling the hearing an ambush masked as justice. But another segment, aired during primetime, played Crockett's full exchange without interruption. One panelist, a conservative legal analyst and former federal prosecutor, said flatly, if he really didn't know, he could have said, "I'm sorry they were hurt." He didn't. That tells you everything. Right-wing influencers scrambled to reframe the moment, but they were outpaced by a flood of veterans, students, and former athletes who had grown up in institutions where silence had been the norm. A former Marine tweeted, "I was taught never to cry and never to question authority. Watching her speak, I realized how much of my life I've spent apologizing to silence." Colleges began responding. Ohio State University issued a statement acknowledging that public institutions must listen when courage forces truth into the open. They offered free trauma counseling for all former athletes from the decades investigated. Northwestern and Penn State, each haunted by their own histories, quietly began internal reviews of complaint handling procedures. Jasmine hadn't just questioned a man, she'd pushed a system to the edge of its reflection. In D.C., tensions boiled. Allies of Jordan within the GOP tried to paint the hearing as a partisan ambush, but behind closed doors, their concern wasn't just optics, it was exposure. If internal memos could be leaked, if sealed testimonies could be read aloud, what else might be waiting in the wings? Several committee members reportedly met privately to discuss narrative containment, but the narrative was already loose, and it had a face, a voice, and 40 million views to carry it forward. Jasmine, for her part, refused interviews for the next 72 hours. When asked by reporters in the hallway if she had any regrets, she paused, looked at the camera and said, "Ask the survivors if they regret finally being heard." Then she walked away. No entourage, no rehearsed lines. Just a woman who had done what institutions had failed to do for decades. Listen and refuse to look away. Meanwhile, Jordan's own colleagues began to distance themselves. In private donor circles, his name no longer appeared on late summer headliner invitations. A prominent conservative PSC issued a statement that read more like a warning. Accountability is not weakness, it's survival. Editorials flooded national newspapers. The New York Times called it a moment of moral clarity. The Washington Post referred to Jasmine's performance as one of the most precise and devastating interrogations Congress has seen in a decade. Even outlets that typically avoided emotional language described it in raw terms. What she did was not political, it was personal. For every person who ever whispered a truth into a room that chose not to hear it. By the 10th day, Jordan remained out of sight. No press conferences, no new statements. His staff repeated the same scripted response to media inquiries. The congressman has no additional comment at this time. But the world had already formed its own conclusions. And back online, the final word didn't come from a lawmaker or a journalist. It came from a video, a stitched TikTok of Jasmine placing the folded testimony on the table, overlaid with one quiet caption: "You didn't need power, you just needed to care." It had 12 million likes in under 24 hours, and still the views kept climbing. Even after the gavel fell, after the headlines started to cycle, and the cameras shifted to another chamber, something lingered, something more enduring than outrage. Because when the noise fades, what remains are the quiet moments. And in one of those, justice walked up to Jasmine Crockett, not with credentials but with trembling hands. The air outside the Capitol had turned heavy, not with rain, but with a thick, reflective quiet. Gray clouds hung low in the sky as Jasmine descended the marble steps alone, her pace unhurried. She was no longer walking out of a hearing. She was walking through the aftermath of a storm that hadn't finished forming. The dome loomed behind her, its grandeur dimmed by dusk. A black car waited at the curb, but Jasmine paused halfway down, one hand wrapped around the strap of her leather briefcase, the other brushing loose strands of hair from her face, damp from the soft mist that had started to fall. She didn't see the boy at first. He had been waiting behind the pillar, his jacket too large for him, his sneakers soaked through from standing still for so long. When she appeared, he hesitated, not out of fear, but caution, the kind born from experience. He stepped forward slowly, looking left, then right, as if unsure whether he should approach at all. His voice was nearly swallowed by the sound of distant traffic. "Congresswoman?" She turned. He was no older than 14. His backpack, slung over one shoulder, hung open, the corner of a textbook jutting out. His hands were fidgeting with a folded note. His voice wavered, not because of stage fright, but because this moment had cost him something to reach. I know I'm not supposed to be here," he said. I saw what you said, in the hearing. I didn't think grown-ups, important ones, would ever say things like that. And I just needed to say thanks." Jasmine stood still, her eyes softening. She didn't reach for him. She didn't rush to fill the silence. She knew this kind of moment was not one to be handled. It had to be honored. The boy took a breath, the kind you take when you're deciding whether to say the thing that has never been said out loud before. "I used to think that people like me, we weren't supposed to talk, that no one would listen." His eyes flicked away. "That no one would believe us anyway." Jasmine knelt, not like a politician greeting a voter, but like someone meeting pain where it lived. She crouched to his level, looked him in the eye, and with the calm strength she had carried through every second of that hearing, she said, "You don't have to carry that alone." She rested a hand over his. "You hear me? You are not alone. Not now. Not ever again." The boy nodded but said nothing more. He looked away quickly, but not before something shifted in his posture. Just slightly. Shoulders that had been hunched with silence now stood just a little straighter. Jasmine stood again, watched him walk back toward the sidewalk, where an older woman, maybe a guardian, maybe a mentor, stood waiting. The boy didn't look back. He didn't need to. She had seen him. That was enough. She exhaled, her breath visible in the cooling air. And in that moment, she realized something that she hadn't fully felt until now. The fight inside the hearing chamber had never just been about accountability. It had been about permission. Permission for people to speak, to heal, to know they were seen. Inside the Capitol, the Judiciary Committee reconvened the following day, but the temperature had changed. The air was thinner, the tone restrained. Jasmine sat quietly in her chair, flipping through a notepad, while cameras searched for someone else to circle. But there was one seat that remained unmistakably empty, the one belonging to Jim Jordan. No formal statement had been issued, no medical absence declared, but this was his third hearing missed. His name had disappeared from talking points. His allies had gone quiet. The chair sat unclaimed like a shadow too large to ignore and too awkward to name. It was in the middle of a procedural vote, nothing remarkable on the surface, that a freshman representative from the Pacific Northwest raised his hand to speak. He was young, new to Congress, still learning to navigate the rhythms of national power. But when he took the mic, his words broke the routine like thunder rolling through stone. "I wasn't planning to speak today," he said, "but after what we witnessed in this chamber, I feel I have to." He turned slightly, nodding in Jasmine's direction. Because what we saw wasn't just testimony, it was accountability, delivered in full. The room quieted. "Some people believe justice only comes from verdicts," he continued, "from juries, from indictments and courtroom transcripts. But I think what we saw that day was something more elemental. Sometimes justice doesn't come in a ruling. It comes when someone finally says, 'No more.'" He paused. "We're not here just to write laws. We're here to reflect the people who never had a chance to speak. And when someone does that, on their behalf with no agenda, no performance, it changes more than a headline. It changes what power feels like in this building." The floor remained quiet after he spoke. No debate followed, no point of order, just the soft sound of shifting chairs and the scratch of pens. Outside the chamber, the clip of the boy thanking Jasmine had been posted by a local journalist. It showed no faces, no names, just a young figure walking toward a woman in a blue blazer. The caption read simply, "You didn't need to save the world. You just needed to listen." It wasn't an official part of the record. It wasn't archived in committee files. But in living rooms, classrooms, veterans centers, and campus counseling offices across the country, it was the only thing that mattered. And though Jim Jordan's chair remained empty, what filled its place was far louder than his voice had ever been. What filled that space, finally, was truth, spoken without shame, heard without condition, and carried forward, one voice braver than the next. The hearing had ended, the headlines had quieted, and the chairs were no longer shaking. But Jasmine knew that what mattered now wasn't just what had been said, it was what people would carry with them after the room had emptied. Because in the wreckage of silence, there is always one question left behind. What will we choose to remember? She returned to her office alone that evening, long after the marble floors of the Capitol had stopped echoing with footsteps and debate. The sun had disappeared behind the dome, leaving a sky smeared with the colors of aftermath. Grays, reds, the soft gold of a battle fought, but not yet finished. Jasmine leaned against the doorframe for a moment before stepping inside, letting the silence greet her not as absence, but as clarity. There were no advisors waiting, no press teams, no champagne, just the quiet hum of a space that had finally served its purpose. On her desk lay the folder, worn, bent, weathered by use. Inside it were the names, the testimonies, the receipts of an injustice too long ignored. She didn't open it. She didn't need to. They were etched into her now, not as facts, but as responsibility. This is what no one tells you about telling the truth in public. It doesn't make you feel heroic. It makes you feel raw, exposed, like someone has peeled back a part of you that no longer belongs to you alone. The public applauds what they understand. But when you speak on behalf of those who were silenced for decades, what they give you instead is silence. And sometimes that's louder than praise. But Jasmine had not stood to be clapped for. She had stood because no one else had. And when she did, she learned the first rule of confronting power. The cost is always higher than they warned you. She'd watched it unfold in real time. The clip had gone viral. Yes, but that wasn't the part that stuck with her. It was what happened after the views. Inboxes flooded with letters not to her, but through her. Messages like, "He told me no one would believe me. I've never said this to anyone before. Your voice sounded like mine would have, if I'd ever been allowed to speak." They weren't confessions. They were ghosts, finally given shape. And in everyone, she heard the same thing. "I thought I was the only one." That was the real indictment. Not against Jordan alone, but against the culture that had made each of those people feel isolated, shamed, forgotten. Not just for what had happened to them, but for daring to name it. Jasmine sat down, hands folded, eyes forward. She didn't feel like a hero. She felt like a mirror. And mirrors aren't glamorous. They're dangerous, because they force people to see what they've chosen to ignore. She thought of the young boy who had approached her after the hearing, the one who didn't ask for anything, just thanked her, then disappeared back into the city. He had no press badge, no public statement, no title. Just a truth too big for his age and a face that still carried the weight of silence. And yet, he had stood there. He had shown up. And in doing so, he had reminded Jasmine why she'd ever opened her mouth in the first place. You see, we talk about courage like it's loud, like it wears capes and demands stages. But the truth is, courage is usually quiet. It knocks once, it waits. And most of the time, no one answers. That boy had knocked, Jasmine had answered. And now, the silence had been broken. That's the lesson. The one too big to fit into a headline. The one that's not sexy enough for prime time, but dangerous enough to shake the bones of power. Silence protects the powerful. But truth? Truth liberates the forgotten. Jim Jordan had power, position, rank, and still, he said he couldn't remember. Jasmine had none of that in that hearing. No majority on the panel, no promises of support. Just a folder of names and a voice that refused to tremble. And in that collision between denial and clarity, the public saw something rare, accountability in real time. Not because a man was sentenced, but because for once, someone was seen. That's what Jasmine had really done. She had seen them, the boys, the athletes, the students who had once thought their pain was private. She had held their truth up in the harshest light possible and refused to look away. She had shown that justice is not a verdict, it is a decision, one made again and again, at every committee table, in every school hallway, behind every closed-door conversation where someone says, "Don't bring that up, it's not worth the trouble." Because the truth is, justice has never been convenient. And that is the second lesson, the one they won't put in textbooks because it's too dangerous to teach. Silence is not neutral, it's a decision, a strategy, a betrayal dressed as procedure. Jasmine had chosen the opposite. She had chosen disruption. She had chosen to sit in a room where everyone expected her to fold, and instead she made them feel the weight they had ignored. And for that, she paid a price. Not in votes, not in approval ratings, but in the ache that only comes from carrying other people's pain as if it were your own. But that ache, it was worth it. Because somewhere out there, another kid is watching, another student, another veteran, another survivor, someone who spent years wondering if the silence was their fault. And when they see Jasmine Crockett at that hearing, when they hear her say, "You don't need power, you just need courage," something in them changes. They begin to believe that maybe, just maybe, someone like them can be more than just what happened to them. Maybe they can be what happens next. And if that's not justice, nothing is. But Jasmine knew this couldn't end with applause or a single empty seat in a hearing room. Because if justice was going to mean something, really mean something, it had to move beyond moments. It had to become movement. She stood again, not on a podium, not in front of a camera, but in front of the people. In a crowded town hall where the walls were too close and the air too warm, Jasmine Crockett didn't deliver a speech. She delivered a challenge. Her voice wasn't angry. It was urgent. The system doesn't change because one person tells the truth, she said. It changes when the rest of us refuse to let that truth be buried again. She paused, eyes scanning the room. Students in folding chairs, retired teachers gripping the edges of their notes, a single mother rocking a stroller with her foot. Don't clap, she said. Act. Her words landed like a spark in dry grass. Don't just repost what you saw. Don't just say, that was powerful. Powerful is nothing without pressure. And pressure means letters. Pressure means votes. Pressure means you showing up, even when they hope you stay home. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.